Cassidy Flynn thought he understood the rules. You stay on your side of the river. They stay on theirs. It was a simple code, etched into the hard-packed dirt and the silent, watchful hills. You don't stare too long at the smoke that curled up from their camps in the twilight. And they don't ride their ponies anywhere near the busted fence line that marked where his world ended and something ancient and unknown began. It was a language of distance, of mutual, unspoken agreement. It was the only reason he was still alive. But that morning, the rules broke. The river, usually a clear and simple boundary, had become a scene of chaos. He'd walked down to check his traps, the morning air still sharp and cold in his lungs, and found something that should never have been there. 2 boys, native, no older than 10, thrashing in the current where the water turned mean. The bend in the river was a treacherous thing, a place where the water got fast and hungry, hiding jagged rocks just beneath its churning surface. They shouldn't have been there, not alone, not this deep into his territory, and the way they fought, a desperate, silent struggle, told him they'd been taught that screaming was a luxury they couldn't afford. It was a lesson learned hard and young out here. A cold knot formed in Cassidy's gut. He was a man who survived by thinking, by calculating every risk. But in that moment, there was no time for thought. His boots were sucking at the river mud before he'd even made the choice. The water was a physical blow, an icy fist that tried to tear him off his feet and drag him downstream. He saw their eyes, wide with a terror so pure it stole his breath. They weren't just drowning. They were being consumed by the river, their small hands clawing at the water as if they could somehow pull themselves back into the world of the living. He got to the first boy, his fingers locking around a thin, bony arm. The current fought him, a living beast trying to claim its prize. He hauled the child toward the bank, his muscles screaming in protest, then he plunged back in for the second. This one was weaker, his struggles fading. Cassidy grabbed a fistful of his tunic and dragged him through the churning water, his own lungs burning, his legs numb with cold. He collapsed on the muddy bank, the 2 boys beside him, coughing up river water, their small bodies racked with violent shivers. They were just kids, maybe 8 and 10, too young to understand the invisible lines they had crossed. They didn't thank him. They didn't even speak. They just stared at him, their dark eyes holding an expression he couldn't decipher. It wasn't gratitude. It was something else, something closer to assessment, like he'd just passed a test he never knew he was taking. Then they exchanged a look, a silent, lightning-fast communication that only siblings possess. And just like that, they were gone. They scrambled to their feet and ran, not back toward the river, but deeper into the hills beyond his property line, vanishing into the dense tree line before Cassidy could even get to his feet. He stood there, dripping, every muscle in his body trembling from cold and the brutal rush of adrenaline. He watched the spot where they had disappeared, a strange emptiness settling over him. He told himself it was over. He'd done a good thing, a human thing, and now he could go back to his quiet life of being invisible, of being left alone by a world that had long since forgotten him. But as the sun bled out behind the mountains, and the vast, empty darkness of the plains swallowed his tiny cabin, he heard it. A sound that didn't belong. Hoofbeats, not the lonely clip-clop of a single rider. This was a sound like rolling thunder, a low, rhythmic drumming that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. It was getting closer, impossibly fast, impossibly organized. He stumbled to his small, grimy window, peering out into the oppressive dark, and what he saw made his heart stop dead in his chest. 100 warriors. He counted them, his mind struggling to process the sight. They emerged from the darkness like ghosts, their forms taking shape in the faint moonlight. They were arranged in a perfect, silent formation, a living wall of muscle and menace. The precision was terrifying. Exactly 100. Not 99, not 101. The number felt deliberate. a message in a language he couldn't speak. And at the very front, sitting on a black horse that seemed carved from the night itself, was a woman. Her posture was so regal, so utterly commanding, that even from this distance he knew she was the one in charge. She was not a person who asked. She was a person who decided. She held something in her hands, though he couldn't make out what it was. But the way every single warrior's gaze was fixed on his small, vulnerable cabin, the way the air itself seemed to crackle with a silent, waiting energy, it told him everything he needed to know. Cassidy Flynn had saved 2 lives, but in doing so, he had broken a rule far older and more important than any fence line. And now, as the woman began to move toward his door, he knew there was nowhere left to run. There was no river to separate them. The boundary was gone, and whatever was coming for him was already here. His hand twitched, instinctively moving toward the old rifle leaning against the doorframe. His fingers brushed against the cool, worn wood before he stopped himself. The math was simple, brutal. 100 warriors, 1 bullet. It wasn't a fight. It was an execution. The woman dismounted with a fluid grace that spoke of a life spent in the saddle. Even in the dim, flickering light from his cabin window, he could see the absolute deference of the warriors behind her. It wasn't fear. It was a deeper, more profound respect, the kind that is earned not through bloodline, but through blood spilled. She moved toward his porch with measured, deliberate steps, each footfall a hammer blow against the silent night. And behind her, the wall of 100 warriors remained perfectly, unnervingly still. He'd counted them again, his eyes now adjusted to the gloom. Exactly 100. The number was a puzzle he couldn't solve, but he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that it meant something terrible. There was no shuffling, no restless movement from the horses. Just a terrifying, disciplined stillness that screamed of a singular, unified purpose. They were waiting for one word, one single command from her, and then his world would be erased. He thought of the boys, their faces, pale and terrified, as he pulled them from the river's grasp. He remembered the look in their eyes afterward. Not thanks. It was something else. Confirmation. Like he'd just stepped onto a stage and played a part he hadn't known was written for him. His cabin door had no lock. He'd never needed one. The kind of trouble that found its way out this far wasn't the kind that could be stopped by a simple piece of metal. He watched through a crack in the warped wood planks as the woman reached his porch. He'd built the 3 steps himself 5 years ago, and they creaked under her weight. 1, 2, 3. Each sound was a tick of a clock counting down to 0. She stopped at his door. She didn't knock. She didn't call out his name. She just stood there, so close he could hear the soft sound of her breathing on the other side of the thin, wooden barrier. Cassidy's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. He was sure she could hear it too. "I know you're in there." Her voice cut through the silence like a shard of glass. It was accented, but sharp and clear. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of undeniable fact. For a fleeting moment, he considered staying silent, pretending the cabin was empty. But the absolute certainty in her tone made that feel like a far more dangerous gamble. Lying to this woman seemed like a fatal mistake. His hand trembled as he reached for the latch. The metal was cold, colder than the river had been. He pulled the door open, just a crack at first, then all the way. She was closer than he'd imagined, standing just inches away. She was tall, her eyes nearly level with his, her face a mask of hard-won survival, etched with the same brutal beauty as the land itself. But her eyes, they held something he couldn't name. It wasn't anger, but it wasn't mercy either. She studied him, her gaze as sharp and penetrating as a hawk's. She took in his worn shirt, his calloused hands, the pants still damp from his morning ordeal. It was the look of a hunter sizing up its prey. Behind her, the silent army watched, their collective gaze a physical weight pressing down on him. The only sound was the wind, a lonely whisper through the cottonwood trees that lined his property. "You pulled my sons from the water," she said. Again, not a question. She knew. Of course, she knew. The boys must have told her. "They said you did not hesitate." Cassidy's throat felt like it was coated in dust. "They were drowning." "Many men would have watched," she said, her eyes never leaving his. "Many men would have weighed the cost. They would have thought about what it might bring to their door." She glanced back at the silent warriors, a flicker of something unreadable in her expression, then her eyes snapped back to him. "You did not think. You just moved." He didn't know how to respond. Was that an accusation? A commendation? The silence stretched between them, taut and fragile. He was acutely aware of his own vulnerability, standing in the open doorway, framed by the lamplight from within, a perfect target. She reached into a leather satchel at her side. Every muscle in Cassidy's body went rigid. His mind screamed at him to run, to fight, to do something, but his feet felt like they were nailed to the floorboards. His blood ran cold. This was it. This was the end. Her hand emerged, holding not a weapon, but a small object wrapped in dark, woven cloth. She held it out to him, her face an unreadable mask. "Among my people," she said, her voice low and steady, "a life debt is a sacred thing. It is not taken lightly. You saved 2 of my blood. That creates a bond that cannot be broken." He stared at the wrapped object, his mind reeling. He couldn't guess its shape or size. His hand moved forward, seemingly of its own accord, his fingers closing around the rough, hand-woven fabric. It was heavier than he expected. A dense, significant weight that settled into his palm and sent a jolt of alarm up his arm. "What is it?" he managed to ask, his voice a rough croak. She didn't answer. Instead, she took a single step back, her eyes still locked on his. "My name is Singing Crow, and you, Cassidy Flynn, are now under the protection of the Iron Ridge people. Any man who raises a hand against you raises it against all of us." The words hung in the cold night air, heavy with a meaning he couldn't begin to comprehend. Protection? From what? He'd lived on this land for a decade, protecting himself from the elements, from predators, from the crushing weight of loneliness. He had survived just fine on his own. Singing Crow turned, moving back toward her horse with that same unnerving grace. The silent army behind her stirred, a subtle, coordinated ripple of movement. She mounted her horse, the leather of the saddle creaking softly. She gathered the reins, then looked at him one last time, her eyes boring into his from across the yard. "Open it when we are gone," she commanded. "Not before." And then she was gone. She wheeled her horse around, and the 100 warriors fell into formation around her, moving as a single, terrifying entity. They disappeared back into the darkness from which they came, the sound of their hoofbeats receding until only the lonely sound of the wind remained. Cassidy stood in his doorway, the heavy, cloth-wrapped object clutched in his hand, his heart still pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He stared out at the empty space where an army had stood just moments before. Protection, a life debt, words from another world, another life. He looked down at the object in his hand. It felt impossibly heavy, impossibly important. She had told him to wait, but standing there, in the threshold between the familiar light of his cabin and the vast, unknowing dark, Cassidy wasn't sure which terrified him more, what lay hidden inside the cloth, or what it meant that they had come all this way just to put it in his hands. He felt like a pawn in a game whose rules he would never understand. He waited until the last faint echo of hoofbeats had been swallowed by the immense silence of the plains. Only then did he step back inside, shutting the door against the night. The cabin felt different. smaller somehow, as if the walls themselves had closed in around him. He placed the wrapped object on his small, scarred wooden table, the lamplight casting long, dancing shadows around it. His hands still trembled, not from the lingering cold of the river, but from something deeper, something that felt too much like fear and not enough like relief. The cloth was intricately woven, a pattern of interlocking geometric shapes in deep blues and reds. It was a thing of beauty, a thing of purpose. With a deep breath, he gently pulled at a loose edge. The fabric fell away. It was a knife. But it was unlike any knife he had ever seen. The blade was obsidian, a piece of volcanic glass so black it seemed to drink the light from the room. It was polished to a mirror shine, catching the flame from the lamp and fracturing it into 1,000 tiny pieces. The handle was wrapped in worn leather, molded perfectly to the shape of a hand that was not his own. Small brass rivets held it in place, and carved into the pommel was a symbol, a bird, perhaps a crow or a hawk, its wings spread wide in mid-flight. He picked it up. The balance was extraordinary. It felt like an extension of his own arm, a tool of lethal purpose. This was not a decorative piece. This was a weapon, crafted by someone who understood the grim realities of survival. But it was the sheath that truly took his breath away. It was made of supple leather, adorned with intricate beadwork in patterns of blue, white, and red. It was the kind of painstaking work that took months, maybe even years, to complete. It was not the kind of thing you gave to a stranger. Cassidy set the knife down on the table as if it were burning hot. Protection, Singing Crow had said. A life debt. He was beginning to understand. This wasn't just a gift. It was a mark, a claim. He had been branded by a people he did not know, for reasons he could not fully grasp. He was tied to them now, whether he liked it or not. He walked to the window and looked out at the empty road. The dust had settled. There was no sign that they had ever been there, save for the tracks of 100 horses carved deep into the earth, tracks that led directly to his door, visible proof that something impossible had just happened. Sleep was a distant country he couldn't reach. He sat at the table all night, the obsidian knife gleaming in front of him, his mind replaying the events of the day. The boys' terrified faces, the silent judgment in their eyes, the impossible arrival of the 100 warriors, the weight of the knife in his hand. He felt like he had been pulled from his own quiet stream and thrown into a raging, unfamiliar river, and he was drowning. Dawn arrived, slow and gray. He was just starting to boil some chicory root, a poor substitute for coffee, but it was hot and bitter, and that was enough, when he heard the sound of a wagon. It was an unfamiliar rhythm, not the slow, steady pace of any of his few neighbors. He moved to the window, his hand resting on the table near the new knife. He recognized the wagon instantly. It belonged to Wade Hollister. Hollister owned the sprawling property 3 miles to the east. He had money, cattle, and a surplus of strong opinions, especially about people like Cassidy, who chose to live too close to what he called the problem. Wade wasn't alone. 2 other men sat beside him on the wagon bench. Cassidy knew them too, Boone Slater and Rufus Garrett. They were the kind of men who made decisions for the rest of the community, men who expected their will to be done. The wagon rattled to a stop about 20 yards from his porch. Wade climbed down, his boots hitting the dirt with the heavy confidence of a man who believed he owned every piece of land he stood on. Boone and Rufus followed, fanning out on either side of him. It wasn't an overtly threatening posture, not yet, but it was the calculated positioning of men who were prepared for trouble. "Cassidy!" Wade's voice boomed across the yard. "We need a talk." Cassidy stepped out onto his porch, leaving the cabin door open behind him. The morning air was crisp, but a line of sweat trickled down his back. "Wade, what can I do for you?" "You can start by telling us about the visitors you had last night," Wade said, his eyes as hard and cold as river stones. The kind of visitors that leave enough tracks for a blind man to follow. The kind that come in numbers that make decent folk nervous. Wasn't aware I needed permission for who comes calling on my own property. You do when it's a war party, Boone Slater cut in, his voice a low growl. His hand was resting casually on the pistol holstered at his hip. He wasn't drawing it, just reminding Cassidy it was there. You do, when it puts the rest of us at risk. Wade held up a hand, silencing Boone with a glance. We're not here to make trouble, Cassidy. We're here as neighbors. What affects one of us affects us all. And 100 warriors riding in the dead of night. Well, that affects everybody. They weren't here for trouble, Cassidy said, his voice surprisingly steady. They came to what? Wade interrupted, taking a step closer. To thank you? For what, Cassidy? What did you do? The question hung in the air, thick and heavy. Cassidy knew he was standing at a precipice. The truth would sound insane. It would make them think he'd gone and allied himself with the enemy. They would see him as something worse than a failure. They would see him as a traitor. But the thought of lying felt like a betrayal of the boys who had fought for their lives in that water, a betrayal of the woman who had ridden all that way to give him a gift of such profound significance. I pulled 2 of their children from the river yesterday, he said quietly. They were drowning. I helped them. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the one from the night before. That one had been filled with a terrifying, unknown potential. This one was heavy with cold, hard judgment. Wade's face hardened, his eyes narrowing to slits. You... what? You heard me. You pulled native children from the water, Wade said, speaking the words slowly, as if they were a foreign language he was struggling to comprehend. You saved them. That's right. Rufus Garrett spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. You're a damn fool, Flynn. Do you have any idea what you've done? You've tied us to them. You've made them think we're... He searched for the word. Friendly. I'm not tied to anybody, Cassidy said. But even as the words left his mouth, he felt the weight of the obsidian knife still sitting on his table inside. He felt the phantom pressure of its handle in his palm. Wade took another step forward, his face contorted with a mixture of anger and disbelief. This is a problem, Cassidy, a big one, and you are going to fix it. You're going to send that knife back. You're going to send word that whatever debt they think they're owed, you don't want it. You are going to make it crystal clear that you are one of us, not one of them. And if I don't? Wade's expression turned glacial. Then you're going to find out what happens to people who choose the wrong side. Cassidy's jaw clenched. He could feel the pressure of their combined stare, the unspoken expectation that he would fold, that he would do as he was told. That was his role in this community. Keep your head down. Don't make waves. Survive by being invisible. But something had changed in him. Maybe it was the terror in those boys' eyes, or maybe it was the unexpected respect in Singing Crows. Whatever it was, he couldn't go back to being the man he was yesterday. Get off my property, he said, his voice low but firm. Wade's face flickered with surprise, then twisted into an ugly sneer. You're making a mistake, Flynn. Maybe, Cassidy replied, but it's my mistake to make. Boone's hand tightened on the grip of his pistol. You really think that protection they promised you means anything out here? You think they're gonna come running every time you get into trouble? I think, Cassidy said, his voice gaining strength despite the fear coiling in his stomach, that the 3 of you rode out here to threaten a man on his own land because you're scared. And scared men do stupid, dangerous things. Rufus took a threatening step forward. You watch your mouth, Flynn. Or what? Cassidy shot back, his fear giving way to a defiant anger. You'll shoot me? Burn down my cabin? He gestured wildly at the sparse, hardscrabble property around them. Look around you. I've got nothing you can take that I can't live without. But they gave me something last night. They gave me respect, and that's something the 3 of you have never offered. Wade's face flushed a deep, mottled red. You're choosing them, over your own kind. My own kind? Cassidy let out a short, harsh laugh. Who exactly is that, Wade? The people in town who call me a failure behind my back? The ones who cross the street to avoid talking to me? You want to talk about sides? You all chose my side for me years ago. I was the outsider long before they showed up. The three men stood there, momentarily silenced. Cassidy could almost see the gears turning in their heads. They had come expecting a weak, pliable man. They had come expecting him to crumble because that's what he had always done. But facing down 100 warriors in the dead of night had a way of changing a man's perspective on what constitutes a real threat. 3 angry neighbors suddenly didn't seem so intimidating. This isn't over, Wade finally snarled, his voice low and venomous. You're going to regret this, Flynn. I promise you that. They climbed back into their wagon, their movements stiff with anger. Wade snapped the reins with unnecessary force, and the wagon lurched away, leaving behind a cloud of dust and the bitter taste of an ultimatum. Cassidy stood on his porch and watched them go, his hands shaking again. But this time, it wasn't fear. It was the tremor of a man who had just walked through fire and, to his own astonishment, hadn't been burned. He went back inside, his heart still hammering. The obsidian knife lay on the table, its dark surface catching the morning light. He picked it up, its weight familiar and comforting in his hand. He had chosen a side, or maybe a side had chosen him. He didn't know what that meant yet, but he knew one thing for sure. His quiet, invisible life was over. He had just finished his lukewarm chicory coffee when a new sound reached him. Not the rattle of a wagon this time. Voices. Multiple voices, laced with a mean-spirited laughter that made the hairs on his arms stand up. They were coming from the direction of his small corral, where he kept his 2 aging horses and a handful of chickens. Cassidy grabbed the knife, shoving it into its beaded sheath and tucking it into his belt. He moved to the back window, and his blood ran cold. 4 men. Not Wade and his cronies. These men were younger, their faces harder, their eyes emptier. He recognized one of them, Dalton Keene, Wade's nephew. Dalton was the kind of young man who used violence as a substitute for a personality. The other 3 were cut from the same rough cloth, their expressions a mixture of boredom and malice, and one of them was holding a lit torch. They were standing by his corral fence. The wood was old and dry as bone. It would go up like kindling. His horses, Nellie and Jack, were inside. They were the only real company he'd had for the last 3 years, the only living creatures who didn't judge him. Cassidy was out the door and running before he even had time to think. The 40 yards between his cabin and the corral felt like a mile. His boots pounded against the hard-packed earth. He saw Dalton turn, a slow, cruel smile spreading across his face as he saw him coming. Well, look who decided to join the party, Dalton called out, his voice dripping with mock cheerfulness. Uncle Wade said you might need a little encouragement to make the right decision. We're just here to help you see things more clearly. The man with the torch stepped closer to the fence. The flames danced and licked at the air, hungry. Nellie and Jack were already growing restless, their ears twitching, their eyes wide with fear. Don't! Cassidy's voice came out as a raw, desperate plea. Whatever Wade told you. Wade told us you're confused about your loyalties, Flynn, Dalton interrupted, his smile widening. He said you needed some clarity. So here it is, plain and simple. You're either with us or everything you have turns to ash, starting with these nags. The torch lowered, the flames just inches from the top rail of the fence. Cassidy could feel the heat from here. His hand went to the obsidian knife at his belt. It was a purely instinctual movement. He had never drawn a weapon on another man in his life. But the sight of that flame, the thought of his horses trapped in a roaring inferno, ignited something primal deep inside him. Last chance, Flynn. Dalton sneered. Send them back their gift. Tell them you made a mistake, or you can watch it all burn. Cassidy's fingers wrapped around the handle of the knife. The worn leather felt warm against his skin. The carved bird seemed to press into his thumb, a silent, urgent message. He thought of Singing Crow's promise, protection, a life debt. He wondered if that protection was just a word, or if it was something real, something tangible. The torch touched the fence. The dry wood caught instantly, the fire crawling up the rail with a hungry, crackling sound. His horses screamed, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror. They kicked and bucked against the inside of the corral, their panic absolute. Cassidy pulled the knife free. The obsidian blade flashed in the morning sun, a sliver of polished night against the bright blue sky. He started to move forward, his mind a red haze of fury and desperation. He didn't know what he was going to do, but he knew he couldn't let them burn his animals. But before he could take more than 2 steps, another sound shattered the morning air. A sound that made all 5 men freeze in place. Hoofbeats, dozens of them, coming hard and fast from the hills. And with them, a sound that was not quite human, a series of piercing cries that seemed to rip through the very fabric of the sky. War cries. 20 warriors crested the nearby hill at a full gallop. They moved not as 20 individual men, but as a single, unstoppable force of nature. Their horses churned up a cloud of dust that caught the sun, turning the air bronze. This wasn't a formal delegation. This was a rapid response, fast, controlled, and, if necessary, lethal. Dalton's face went bone white. The torch fell from his companion's nerveless fingers, sputtering out in the dirt. All 4 of them were frozen, caught between the burning fence and the oncoming tidal wave of warriors. Their sneering bravado evaporated like morning mist on a hot rock. The warriors didn't slow until they were 30 feet away, where they fanned out into a perfect semicircle, cutting off any possibility of escape. Their horses stomped and snorted, their energy a mirror of the coiled tension in their riders. At the front rode a man Cassidy hadn't seen before. He was older, his face dominated by a wicked scar that ran from his temple to his jawline. He carried a rifle across his saddle, not aiming it at anyone, but its presence was a clear and unambiguous statement. Behind them, the fire on the corral fence continued to burn. Cassidy's horses were still screaming, their eyes rolling in terror. He wanted to run to them, to put out the fire, to calm them, but he was as frozen as Dalton and his thugs. The entire scene was balanced on the razor's edge of bloodshed. One wrong move, and this patch of dirt would be soaked in blood. The scarred warrior's eyes took in the scene with a swift, calculating glance, the burning fence, the terrified horses, the 4 pale-faced settlers, and finally, Cassidy, standing alone with the obsidian knife in his hand. His expression was impossible to read. He spoke, his words sharp and guttural, in his own language. It was a question, Cassidy was sure of it, but the tone was that of a judge demanding an answer. Cassidy swallowed, his throat dry. They were trying to make me refuse your gift, he stammered. They were trying to... The warrior held up a hand, and Cassidy fell silent. His gaze shifted back to Dalton, studying him with the detached curiosity of a man looking at an insect he was about to crush. When he finally spoke, his English was heavily accented, but every word was perfectly clear. You burn his property. You threaten his animals. You do this because he showed mercy to our children. Dalton found his voice, though it was thin and reedy. We were just... Wade said. Wade! The warrior repeated the name, his lip curling in a slight sneer. And where is this Wade? Why does he send boys to do a man's work? Dalton and his friends had no answer. The warrior looked from them to the burning fence, then back to Cassidy. Put out the fire. The command was so sudden, so direct, it took Cassidy a moment to realize it was aimed at him. He broke from his paralysis and ran to the fence, using his own coat to beat at the flames. The warriors sat on their horses, watching him, their faces impassive. They weren't here to do his work for him. They were here to ensure he was allowed to do it. The fire was still small. He managed to smother it, his coat now scorched and smoking. He threw open the corral gate, and Nellie and Jack bolted out, their flanks lathered in sweat. They galloped to the far end of his property, their panic slowly subsiding as they put distance between themselves and the danger. When Cassidy turned back, the scarred warrior had dismounted. He walked toward Dalton with a slow, deliberate gait, the walk of a predator that knows its prey is trapped. Dalton and his friends stumbled backward until their backs were pressed against the charred fence rails. Singing Crow spoke the truth, the warrior said, his voice a low rumble. This man is under our protection. Do you understand what that means? Dalton nodded his head frantically, his eyes wide with terror. No, the warrior's voice hardened. You do not, so I will teach you. He took another step, so close now that he towered over Dalton. You come to this land again. You speak this man's name with disrespect. You bring harm to him or his animals in any way, and I will know. And the next time I come, it will not be to talk. He reached out and grabbed a fistful of Dalton's shirt, pulling him close. Do you understand now? Yes, Dalton whispered, the word barely audible. The warrior's gaze swept over the other three. All of you? They all nodded, their earlier arrogance replaced by a primal, shaking fear. The warrior held Dalton for a moment longer, then shoved him away in disgust. He spat on the ground at their feet, a gesture that was universally understood. He turned, walked back to his horse, and mounted in one smooth, practiced motion. Before he turned to leave, he looked at Cassidy. You carry the knife? He asked. Cassidy touched his belt, where the sheathed blade was a comforting weight. Yes. Good. You will need it. Not just for fighting. You need it to remember. You saved our blood. That makes you our blood, and blood does not abandon blood. With that, the warriors wheeled their horses around and rode back toward the hills, moving as one. The sound of their departure seemed to fill the sudden, ringing silence. Cassidy stood there, his scorched coat clutched in one hand, watching them disappear. Dalton and his friends were already scrambling for their own horses, which were tied just over a nearby rise. They fled without a single backward glance. The silence that descended was profound. It was an answer. Protection wasn't just a word whispered in the dark. It was 20 warriors on fast horses. It was real and immediate and terrifyingly effective. They must have been watching. They had to have been, to arrive so quickly. Which meant they had probably seen Wade's visit earlier, too. A chilling thought settled in his mind. How long had they been watching him? He looked down at the knife at his belt. Blood does not abandon blood. He had spent 10 years convincing himself that being alone was the same thing as being safe. But standing there, the acrid smell of smoke still in the air, his heart still hammering from what he had almost lost, he understood. Being alone wasn't safety. It was vulnerability. Being connected, even to a people his neighbors feared, meant he wasn't invisible anymore. It meant he mattered enough for someone to ride to his aid. He started walking back toward his cabin, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and a strange, burgeoning sense of hope. But he was only halfway there when he heard yet another sound. Another wagon. A single horse moving slow. Cassidy's hand flew to his knife, the motion now becoming a grimly familiar reflex. The wagon came into view and his stomach plummeted. It was Wade, alone this time. And from the look on his face, pale, tight, and radiating a furious, impotent rage, he had seen the warriors leaving. He must have been waiting just out of sight. Wade pulled his horse to a halt. His voice, when he spoke, was shaking with a rage he could barely contain. You've made your choice, Flynn. Now you get to live with the consequences. You think they'll always be there to protect you? You think you can hide behind them forever? He leaned forward, his knuckles white where he gripped the reins. Everything you have left, everyone who might have stood by you, it's all gone now. You're marked. And when they finally get tired of you, when they decide you're not worth the trouble anymore, we'll be waiting. He didn't wait for a reply. He yanked the reins, turning the wagon with a savage jerk, and drove away, leaving Cassidy standing alone in his yard. The smoke still curled up from his burned fence, and the taste of ash was on his tongue. The obsidian knife at his belt suddenly felt a whole lot heavier. 3 days passed in a tense, watchful silence. Cassidy repaired the burned section of his fence, the rhythmic work of his hands a small comfort against the storm in his mind. His horses had returned, still skittish but unwilling to abandon their home. The chickens, blissfully unaware of the complexities of human conflict, clucked and scratched in the dirt as always. The world looked the same, but Cassidy knew, with a bone-deep certainty, that everything had changed. On the 4th morning, he rode into town. He was running low on flour, salt, and nails, the basic necessities that stood between a man and starvation. The general store was run by Otis Caldwell, a quiet man who had always been fair with him, extending credit when others wouldn't. But the moment Cassidy pushed open the door, the low hum of conversation inside ceased. 3 men, all of whom he knew, fell silent. One of them, Nolan Travis, who had bought eggs from him just last month, took one look at Cassidy and deliberately turned his back. Otis stood behind the counter, his face a mask of discomfort. He polished an already clean spot on the counter, refusing to meet Cassidy's eyes. "Otis," Cassidy said, his voice sounding loud in the sudden silence. "Need to pick up a few things." "Can't help you, Cassidy." The words were quiet, but they landed like a punch to the gut. "What do you mean, you can't help me?" "Word came down from Wade," Otis mumbled, his eyes still fixed on the counter. "Anyone who does business with you is choosing a side, the same side you chose." He finally looked up, his eyes pleading. "I've got a family, Cassidy, a business to protect. I can't afford to get on the wrong side of Wade." "I haven't done anything wrong," Cassidy said, his voice rising in frustration. "You chose them over us," Nolan Travis said, his voice hard, his back still turned. "That's wrong enough for most folk." Cassidy stood there, the weight of their collective judgment pressing down on him. He could argue. He could tell them about the 2 drowning boys. He could try to make them understand. But looking at their closed, fearful faces, he knew it was pointless. They had already tried and convicted him. He was no longer one of them. He left the store without another word, his saddlebags still empty. The ride home was long and lonely. Wade's threat echoed in his mind. "Everything you have left. It's all gone now." He hadn't understood how complete that ostracism would be. He had a week's worth of flour, maybe 2 if he rationed it. After that, he didn't know. He was measuring out the last of his real coffee, a precious, dwindling supply, when he heard a single horse approaching. His hand went to the knife at his belt, the motion now as natural as breathing. He looked out the window and recognized the rider. It was one of the warriors from the other day. Not the scarred leader, but a younger man. The warrior rode right up to the cabin and dismounted with a practiced, easy grace. He held up a hand in a gesture of peace, then reached into a pack tied behind his saddle. He pulled out a large bundle wrapped in leather and canvas and set it on the ground near Cassidy's porch. He looked at Cassidy, his dark eyes seeming to see right through him. "You went to town," the warrior said. It wasn't a question. Cassidy nodded grimly. "They wouldn't sell to me." "We know," the warrior replied, his face impassive. He gestured to the bundle on the ground. "Flour, salt, dried meat, coffee. Singing Crow said you would have need of them." Cassidy stared at the bundle, then back at the warrior, bewildered. "How did you... Were you watching me?" "We protect what is ours," the warrior said simply. "You are ours now, so we watch." We see. We provide. I can't accept this, Cassidy said, the words feeling hollow even as he said them. You can, and you will. The warrior moved back to his horse. Among my people, when a life is saved, the saver becomes responsible for that life, but the saved also become responsible for the saver. The debt flows both ways. You saved our children. Now, we save you. He swung himself up into the saddle, then paused, looking back at Cassidy. My name is Running Wolf. The boys you saved. They are my nephews. My sister is Singing Crow. What you did at the river. Very few men would have done that. So when I say we protect our own, understand this. You are not some outsider we tolerate. You are family. We have claimed you. The word hung in the air between them. Family. Cassidy hadn't had a family in years, not one that mattered. To hear that word now, from a man whose people his neighbors saw as enemies, it felt like something breaking open inside his chest, something he had thought was long dead. I don't know what to do, Cassidy admitted, his voice barely a whisper. I don't know how to be a part of this. You do what you have always done, Running Wolf said, a hint of a smile touching his lips. You survive, you work your land, you live with honor. The rest, you will learn. We are patient. He turned his horse and rode away, a silent, powerful figure against the vast landscape. Cassidy stood there for a long time, staring at the bundle at his feet. He finally knelt and opened it. It was exactly as Running Wolf had promised. Fine ground flour, salt, strips of dried meat that smelled of smoke and sage, a generous pouch of dark, rich coffee beans, and at the very bottom, wrapped in a separate cloth, was a beautifully woven blanket, its patterns of red and black a testament to hours of skilled work. He carried it all inside, a lump forming in his throat. He had been preparing to starve, to face the coming winter alone and defeated. But help had come. Unasked for, unconditional. All because of one simple act of decency. He was putting the supplies away when he heard it, not hoofbeats this time, shouting, distant but clear, and underneath the shouting a sound that made his blood run cold, the hungry crackle of a large fire. Cassidy ran to the window. In the distance, maybe 2 miles to the east, a thick column of black smoke was roiling into the sky. It was coming from the direction of Wade Hollister's property. The shouting grew louder, more frantic. He could make out the words now. Fire! The barn! Help us! His neighbors, the same men who had turned their backs on him that morning. Their homes were burning. They were screaming for help. Every rational instinct in Cassidy's body told him to stay put. Let them deal with their own damn problems. They had made it clear he was an enemy. He owed them nothing. Nothing at all. But even as the thought crossed his mind, he was already moving, grabbing buckets, running for his horse. Because if he let their hatred turn him into them, then what was the point of any of it? He was throwing a saddle on Nellie when he heard more hoofbeats. He looked up to see Running Wolf, riding hard, and he wasn't alone. 5 other warriors were with him. They had seen the smoke, too. Running Wolf pulled his horse up beside him. You go to help them? It's a fire, Cassidy said, his voice grim. People could die. A look of something that might have been respect flickered across Running Wolf's face. They will not thank you for this. I know. They may hate you even more for it. Probably, Cassidy agreed, tightening the cinch on his saddle. Running Wolf turned to his companions and spoke in his own language. They nodded in unison. And then, to Cassidy's utter astonishment, they all dismounted and began grabbing buckets and blankets, anything that could be used to fight a fire. You do not go alone, Running Wolf said, his voice firm. Family does not let family face danger alone. They arrived at Wade's property to a scene of chaos and devastation. The massive barn was a roaring inferno, flames leaping 50 feet into the air, a shower of angry sparks threatening the nearby house. Wade and a dozen other men had formed a desperate bucket brigade from the well, but it was a losing battle. The fire was too big, too hot, too fast. Cassidy leaped from his horse and joined the line without a word, grabbing a dropped bucket. Running Wolf and his warriors fanned out, their movements economical and purposeful, immediately reinforcing the weakest points in the line. For a stunned moment, the settlers just stared, their faces a mixture of fear and disbelief at the sight of the warriors working among them. Wade, his face black with soot, his eyes wide with panic, saw Cassidy. A look of pure, unadulterated hatred twisted his features. But before he could speak, a massive beam inside the barn gave way with a deafening crack. A section of the roof collapsed, sending a fresh volcano of flames and sparks into the sky. "Move!" Running Wolf's voice cut through the roar of the fire. "The house will be next! We must create a fire break!" And as if his voice had broken a spell, the settlers moved. Cassidy found himself working side by side with Boone Slater, the man who had threatened him just days before. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They just passed buckets, their movements falling into a desperate shared rhythm. They fought the fire for 2 brutal hours. By the time it was over, the barn was a heap of smoldering, blackened ruins, but the house and the other outbuildings had been saved. Men collapsed where they stood, their bodies aching, their lungs burning, their hands raw and blistered. Cassidy sat in the dirt, coughing, watching the last of the smoke drift up into the twilight sky. Wade walked toward him, his steps slow and heavy. His face was a battlefield of conflicting emotions, shame, anger, and a grudging, unwilling gratitude. "You came," Wade said, his voice a hoarse rasp. "Fire doesn't care whose side you're on," Cassidy replied, his own voice raw. Wade's jaw worked, as if he were trying to chew on words that were too bitter to swallow. "They came with you." "They're my family now," Cassidy said, getting to his feet, his legs trembling with exhaustion. "You wanted me to choose a side, Wade. Well, I did, and they chose me back, which is more than I can say for anyone else around here." Running Wolf rose and came to stand beside Cassidy, his presence a silent, powerful statement. Wade's eyes flickered between the two of them, a new, unwelcome calculation dawning in his mind. Around them, the other settlers watched, their expressions ranging from fear to confusion to the first fragile glimmerings of understanding. Rufus Garrett, the man who had called Cassidy a fool, stepped forward. His face was streaked with soot, his clothes singed. He looked directly at Running Wolf. "Thank you," he said, the words clearly costing him a great deal, "for helping us. You didn't have to." Running Wolf held his gaze for a long moment. "No," he said, his voice steady. "We did not. We chose to. We chose to because this man," he gestured to Cassidy, "chose to help our children when he did not have to. This is how honor works. What you give is returned. What you take is taken from you." The implication hung in the smoky air. Wade's face flushed, but he said nothing. He couldn't. Cassidy and the warriors mounted their horses. As they prepared to leave, Cassidy looked back at Wade. "Your nephew, Dalton," he said, his voice carrying in the sudden quiet. "He's the one who started this fire. I saw him and his friends riding away as we arrived. You might want to ask yourself who your real enemies are." Wade's face went from red to a ghostly white. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Cassidy didn't wait for a reply. He turned his horse and rode away, the warriors falling in around him, a silent, protective escort in the gathering dusk. They rode in silence for a long time, the only sound the rhythmic beat of their horses' hooves. When they were halfway back to Cassidy's property, Running Wolf raised a hand, and the group came to a halt. "You did a good thing today," Running Wolf said, his voice low in the twilight, "to help those who would not help you. That is the mark of a truly strong man." "Didn't feel strong," Cassidy admitted. "Felt stupid." Often they are the same thing, Running Wolf said with a rare, fleeting smile. Singing Crow wishes to speak with you tomorrow. She says there are things you must understand, about what has happened, and about what is to come. A cold dread seeped into Cassidy's bones. What do you mean? What's to come? The balance has shifted, Running Wolf said, his expression growing serious. Some of your people, they see now that we are not the monsters they imagined. They see that we honor our debts. But others, his voice darkened, others will only see this as a sign of weakness. They will believe that if we show mercy, we can be exploited. Men like Wade, they will test us. They will push to see how far our protection extends. His hand rested on the hilt of his own knife. Singing Crow wants you to understand the war you have stepped into. The warriors resumed their ride, but Cassidy's mind was reeling. He had thought this was the end of it. He had thought that by choosing honor, by standing up to Wade, he had reached the climax of his story. But as he watched Running Wolf, alert and watchful in the saddle, he realized with a sinking heart that this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. They reached his property as full darkness fell. The warriors didn't leave. They took up positions around his small cabin, their movements efficient and strategic. We will keep watch tonight, Running Wolf said. After what you told Wade about his nephew, he may be foolish enough to seek retaliation. Humiliated men are dangerous. You don't have to do this. We do, Running Wolf said, his voice leaving no room for argument. You are family. We protect our own. Sleep, Cassidy Flynn. We will hold the darkness back. Cassidy went inside, but sleep was an impossible dream. He sat at his table, the obsidian knife before him, and watched the silent, shadowy figures of the warriors as they guarded his home. He had saved 2 boys from a river, a single act of decency. But that one act had shattered the fragile peace of this land. And tomorrow, Singing Crow would tell him the true cost of his choice. The knife gleamed in the lamplight, its polished surface reflecting a future that was darker and more dangerous than he could ever have imagined. Dawn broke with the smell of coffee. Real coffee. Running Wolf and 2 other warriors were tending a small fire just outside his cabin. They had stood guard all night, their vigilance absolute. Cassidy felt a strange, unfamiliar sense of safety. She is coming, Running Wolf said, his eyes fixed on the distant hills. Singing Crow. She brings the elders with her. This is a formal council. It is important. A knot of anxiety tightened in Cassidy's stomach. Soon, a group of about 20 riders appeared, emerging from the morning mist. Singing Crow was at the front, flanked by several older men whose faces were like ancient maps, etched with the wisdom and hardship of a lifetime. They approached his property with a slow, ceremonial gravity. Singing Crow dismounted, her eyes locking with his. We must speak plainly, Cassidy Flynn, about what you have done, and what it means for all of us. She gestured toward his cabin. Inside, what I have to say is for your ears first. His small cabin seemed to shrink with her presence. She walked to his table, and her eyes fell on the obsidian knife. A flicker of something unreadable, something almost soft, passed through her expression. You carry it, she said. It felt right, he replied. She nodded, then took a deep, steadying breath. My sons, she began. The boys you saved. They were not supposed to be near that river. They disobeyed me. They went to prove their bravery, a foolish, childish thing to do. She paused, her voice thick with an emotion she struggled to control. If they had drowned, it would have been my failure. But it would have been more than that. It would have broken the last piece of my heart, their father. He died 2 winters ago. They are all I have left of him. All I have left of my future. I'm sorry, Cassidy said quietly. I didn't know. How could you? She said. But that is why what you did was so much more than just saving 2 boys. You did not just save strangers. You saved my bloodline. You saved my hope. Among my people, such a debt is absolute. It can only be repaid with absolute protection. With blood, if it comes to that. The word hung in the air between them. Blood. What's going to happen? He asked. That depends on your neighbors, she said, her voice grim. What you did at the fire yesterday. Some saw it as a sign of your honor. The elders believe it proves you are worthy of our protection. But others, men like Wade, will see it only as an opportunity. He has already sent riders to the other settlements. He is telling them that we are using you as an excuse to claim their land. He is twisting our honor into a threat. He is trying to start a war. Ice formed in Cassidy's veins. He wants to force your hand, he said, the pieces clicking into place. He wants to push you until you have to choose between protecting me and protecting your own people. He does not understand, she said, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. We do not break our word, ever, even if it costs us everything. Then don't, Cassidy said, his voice urgent. Don't risk your people for me. I can leave. I can disappear. Where would you go? She asked, her question gentle but sharp. And if we let you go, what message does that send? That our honor is for sale? That our protection is meaningless? She shook her head. No. You saved my sons. You are family now, and family does not run. Suddenly, there was a commotion outside. Raised voices, angry voices. Cassidy rushed to the window, and his heart seized. It was Wade, and he had brought an army of his own. At least 30 men, all armed, all with the same hard, resolute look on their faces. This wasn't a discussion. This was an invasion. Running Wolf and the other warriors had already formed a line between the mob and the cabin, but they were hopelessly outnumbered. Singing Crow strode past Cassidy and stepped out onto the porch, her presence alone a challenge. This ends today, Singing Crow, Wade yelled, his hand resting on the rifle across his saddle. This man, he pointed a trembling finger at Cassidy, has endangered us all. He has made a deal with you that puts all of our homes at risk. He made no deal, Singing Crow's voice rang out, clear and strong. He showed mercy. We are simply returning the honor. We protect our own, that is all. He's not your own, Wade roared back. He was one of us, until he chose to betray his people. Cassidy stepped forward, his own anger boiling over. I didn't betray anyone. I saved 2 drowning children. Everything that has happened since is because of your hatred, Wade, not my actions. You accepted their protection, Wade spat. You let them claim you. Now they think they have a foothold on our land. We claim no land, one of the elders said, his voice ancient but powerful. We claim only this man. His life is owed to us by honor, nothing more. Then leave him, Wade shouted, a triumphant, ugly look on his face. He thought he had them trapped. Walk away. Prove that your honor is just a word. The silence was absolute. The tension was a physical thing, a spark waiting to ignite a wildfire. Cassidy could feel the weight of 30 rifles all aimed in his direction. He saw the cold, hard calculation in Wade's eyes. Singing Crow's hand moved to her own weapon. The warriors shifted, readying themselves. We do not abandon our own, she said, her voice low and deadly. Not for threats, not for fear, not ever. Wade's face twisted in fury. He raised his rifle, aiming it squarely at Cassidy's chest. Then you've chosen war. But before he could fire, before anyone could react, a new voice cut through the tension. Put it down, Wade. Everyone turned. It was Otis Caldwell, the store owner, and he wasn't alone. 5 other settlers stood with him, all of them holding rifles. It wasn't a large group, but it was enough. It was a crack in the wall of hatred Wade had built. Among them was Rufus Garrett. What in the hell are you doing, Otis? Wade snarled, his rifle still trained on Cassidy. What I should have done days ago, Otis said, his voice shaking but firm. I'm standing with a man who saved children from drowning. I'm standing with the man who helped save your property, Wade, when he had every reason to let it burn to the ground. He's shown more honor in 1 week than you've shown in a lifetime." "He brought them here," Wade raged. "No," Rufus Garrett said, his voice surprisingly strong. Cassidy stared at him in disbelief. "We brought them here, with our threats, with our foolish pride. We're the ones who punished a man for doing the right thing." He looked directly at Wade. "Cassidy told you your own nephew started that fire. Did you even listen? Or are you so blinded by your hate that you can't see that the enemy is us?" Wade's face went purple, but before he could reply, one of the elders spoke again. "This man Wade speaks of a war that exists only in his own fearful heart. We have made our intentions clear. We protect this one man on his one piece of land. Nothing more. Anyone who sees a threat in that is a man who is afraid of shadows." The standoff stretched, the air thick with the possibility of violence. Cassidy knew this was the final moment. This was where it all ended, in blood and fire. He took a deep breath and stepped forward, past Singing Crow, past the line of warriors, into the open space between the two groups. Wade's rifle followed him, the dark hole of the barrel a final, unblinking eye. "I'm right here, Wade," Cassidy said, his voice calm and clear. "If you're going to shoot someone, shoot me. But before you do, ask yourself what happens next. You think killing me ends this? Or does it just prove to everyone here that you were never about safety? That you just couldn't stand the thought that someone like me, someone you all looked down on, was worthy of honor, worthy of being protected?" Wade's hand was shaking. The rifle barrel trembled. Behind him, several of his men were lowering their own weapons, their faces filled with a dawning uncertainty. "I watched you at that fire, Wade," Cassidy continued, his voice resonating with a newfound authority. "I saw you surrounded by people who had come to help you, your neighbors, and the warriors you call your enemies. They all work together, because that's what decent people do. They help. They don't draw lines in the dirt. They don't choose sides." He turned, looking at every face, native and settler alike. "I'm done choosing sides. I saved 2 boys because they were human beings in trouble. That's it. That's the whole story. And if that makes me a traitor in your eyes, then I'll wear that name with pride. I'd rather be a traitor who can sleep at night than a loyal man who would watch children die." The silence that followed was different. The tension had broken. Doubt had crept in. Wade looked at the faces of his own men, and for the first time he saw that he was losing them. He slowly, reluctantly lowered his rifle. "This isn't over," he muttered, but the threat was empty. "Yes, it is, Wade," Otis said, his voice tired. "It's over, because the rest of us are done. We're done making enemies out of neighbors." He looked at Singing Crow. "Your people helped save my store from a flood 3 years ago. We just never talked about it, because it was easier to fear you than to thank you." Singing Crow held his gaze, then gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Perhaps it is time we all stopped being afraid." Wade looked at the crumbling remains of his mob, his face a mask of bitter defeat. "You're all fools," he spat. He wheeled his horse around and rode away. Only half of the men he'd brought with him followed. The rest remained, their faces uncertain, but no longer hostile. Running Wolf came to stand beside Cassidy. "You spoke with honor. I just spoke the truth." "Often," Running Wolf said with a hint of a smile, "they are the same thing." Singing Crow approached, and for the first time, Cassidy saw open approval in her eyes. "You did not hide behind our protection," she said. "That is why it will never be withdrawn. You understand that it is a bond, not just a shield." She paused. "My sons wish to thank you properly. Will you come to our camp? Will you share our food, as family?" Cassidy looked at Otis and the other settlers. Otis just smiled. "Go on. We'll be here when you get back. It's time we all learned how to be better neighbors." 3 days later, Cassidy stood on his porch, watching the sun set over a land that looked the same, but felt entirely new. Running Wolf sat by his corral, sharing a quiet joke with another warrior. Inside his cabin, supplies from Singing Crow sat next to supplies from Otis. The two boys had thanked him, their small hands pressing a woven bracelet onto his wrist, another visible mark of his new family. He wore it now. Wade was isolated on his own land, his hatred a poison that only he had to swallow. Cassidy picked up the obsidian knife. He thought about the man he had been just a week ago, lonely, invisible, afraid. He had made one choice, one simple choice to act with decency in a world that had shown him very little. And that single choice had changed everything. It hadn't just saved two boys. It had saved him. It had given him something he had long ago given up on. A home, a family, a place to belong. He sheathed the knife and walked toward the fire where Running Wolf was waiting. He was walking toward his future, a future he had never imagined, but one that he was finally ready to claim as his own. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale from the frontier, where courage and honor collide in unexpected ways. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.